Hey everybody, welcome to the 2025 installment of my questions and answers videos. For those of you who don't know what these are, this is an opportunity for viewers to ask me questions that aren't necessarily related to games, but they can be related to games. And as of the last couple of them, I've decided to go ahead and do this on a yearly basis as a sort of capstone for Requests Month, although things obviously haven't gone according to plan this year. Now, all that said, of course, the question submissions are open for next year's Q&A, so if you have a question you want to ask that hasn't been covered in one of the previous Q&As, then feel free to throw it in the comments, or if you're a supporter on Patreon, you can throw it to me on Patreon, and if it's something that I consider appropriate for your Q&A, I'll consider answering it in next year's Q&A. Now, things that won't be considered appropriate for Q&A are things like political questions, simply because I'm sick of politics, you're sick of politics, and even though I really don't like talking about politics, for a lot of games these days, I end up having to talk about them because they end up negatively affecting the game. So let's just leave that kind of stuff out of the Q&As, so when I have to talk about it for any particular game that suffers from that problem, I can talk about it there. And with the Q&As, we can focus on other things that are considerably more interesting and considerably less divisive, let's put it that way. As for other questions I won't consider appropriate for Q&As, it includes things like, what do you think about insert game here, or will you review insert game here, because those I'll consider review requests, and if it's something I don't already have on the master list of requests, reviews, etc., then I'll go ahead and add it on there. Now, if you're just using a game as an example of what you're talking about, that's fine, don't worry about that. But as far as what do you think about insert game here, that's going to be treated as a review request. You can, however, ask about specific features or specific aspects of a particular game, and I might consider answering that, but if it's something that I don't want to answer in the Q&A, I'll probably just respond to your comment instead. Another thing to mention about if you submit a question for next year's Q&A is that I do credit the questions to whoever asked them, so if you prefer to remain anonymous or there's a specific name you would rather me call you, then go ahead and mention that in your question submission as well. One other thing to note about the video itself before we begin is that the gameplay footage you'll be seeing in the background is of various projects that I'm currently working on that are in various stages of completion, so keep an eye out for videos on those things in the future. With all that said, let's go ahead and just start delving right into the questions. We're going to go ahead and start with a question from Garcia1995, which is, what do you think about unlockable difficulty levels, or if they should be already unlocked from the start? Well, it depends on how difficulty is handled in the game in general. Are these unlockable difficulty levels the only other difficulty settings available, and you have to play through the game on a baseline difficulty in order to unlock them? Or do you have a selection of difficulty levels that are already there, and then these are some extra challenge modes, more or less, that are unlocked later on? If it's the extra challenge mode thing, that's fine. That's just something extra for people who want to replay the game on a harder difficulty setting. If the game only has one difficulty setting to begin with, however, then that's where things get pretty tricky. You see, the game that immediately comes to mind in a situation like this is the original Max Payne, where you had the basic fugitive mode to start with, and then once you finished it on that baseline difficulty, then you unlock additional difficulty modes of Hardboiled and Death on Arrival, as well as an extra mode called New York Minute. And if all this were finely tuned, then that would be fine. The problem is that Max Payne has adaptive difficulty, so depending on how good you are at the game, it'll raise or lower the difficulty, which means that if you were playing the game and kind of breezing through it at first, it'll start ramping up that difficulty very quickly, and that can be pretty whiplash-inducing. Now, of course, very few games actually use adaptive difficulties, so that's definitely an outlier situation. But that's the kind of risk you run whenever you have only one difficulty option available from the start. If it's well tuned, then it's going to feel like it provides enough challenge without being overwhelming, but if it's not finely tuned, then you're going to alienate a good chunk of the player base, either the people who find the game just too difficult right from the get-go, or people who find it too easy right from the get-go, and one of the additional unlockable difficulty settings more or less fixes the problems that they have with it. And the really big problem you run into is that a lot of game developers really don't know how to balance out difficulty settings like that effectively. And this is for one of two reasons. The first is that developers who are very heavily involved in their projects, ones who are really into it, will probably be playing the game constantly as they're making it. And because they play the game so much, they are very likely to just be really good at it. This in turn skews their perception of how easy or difficult any particular aspect of the game is. The other end of the spectrum, however, is the game developers who put barely any time into actually playing the game or absolutely no time into playing the game to test things out, and thus have basically no idea how easy or difficult something is. Now, of course, any game developer worth their salt isn't going to just not play through the game as they're making it, but with modern AAA games in particular, they rely very heavily on focus group testing, and it shows. I mean, just think about how easy most AAA games are, and how they basically drag you through the entire thing by the nose, because the developers are confident you're not going to have any idea how to play the thing. That's because they do a lot of focus group testing, and whenever they do that sort of thing, they seem to go out of their way to find the most incompetent morons they possibly can, and almost exclusively listen to their feedback rather than people who actually seem to know what they're doing, because they want to get as many sales as possible, and thus they develop for the lowest common denominator. And in a situation like that, let's face it, the difficulty is just not going to be properly tuned, and any kind of unlockable difficulty settings are going to be iffy no matter what they do. So yeah, to summarize that one, it just depends on how they're implemented. If they're implemented properly, then unlockable difficulty settings are perfectly fine. If they're not implemented properly, not so much. Next question is from a viewer who prefers to remain anonymous. Would I recommend using Linux for gaming? And if so, which distribution or distributions do I recommend? No, I don't. The driver support still isn't there for especially NVIDIA, but also AMD and now Intel, now that they've got their hand in the GPU market. Then, of course, there's a matter of what you can play on Windows versus Linux in terms of multiplayer games, because a lot of multiplayer games these days use kernel-level anti-cheats that just don't work on Linux. And because Linux is such a minuscule portion of the audience, the anti-cheat developers have no real incentive to actually make those things work on Linux. And even once you get past driver issues and anti-cheat problems if you're into multiplayer games, there's still two major problems. The first is that a lot of games simply weren't made to run on Linux, so if you're using something like a Steam Deck or the compatibility layer that Steam Deck and SteamOS use, or other forms of compatibility applications like Wine, that can all still be really hit or miss. Sometimes it works perfectly, sometimes it's a bit janky, sometimes it doesn't work at all, and it's just going to depend on which games you're playing. But then there's the real elephant in the room, which is Linux is not an operating system that the average person can just pick up and use. Now, of course, if you're a power user who knows a lot about how computers work, knows a lot about how software works, then Linux can be absolutely great for you, because you can get really into the nitty-gritty of things, you can set it up the way you really want to, and you're going to be pretty comfortable messing around with things like Terminal to actually do what you need to do. But for the average user, they're just going to want something that works right out of the box and is basically idiot-proof, and Linux is about as far from idiot-proof as you can possibly get. Even when you're using a distro like Ubuntu, which is designed to be more friendly to the average user, you're still going to have to get in there and mess around with the terminal on a pretty regular basis to do even pretty simple things that on Windows would just be a few clicks. But of course in Linux you might have to do a sudo command to do even something pretty simple and straightforward, and eventually you're going to get to the point where the average user is either just going to be like, nope, this is not for me, and they're going to switch over to a Mac or a Windows computer, or frankly, much more likely, they're going to accidentally break something, and then they have to take it to their techie friends to figure out what the hell they did and how to fix it. So no, Linux fans, as much as you want Linux to become the dominant operating system, it's not going to happen, and frankly, if it did, you would suddenly start hating it, because for it to become the dominant operating system, it would have to give up a lot of the things that simply make Linux what it is, and make it why people enjoy it in the first place. Now, is there a place for it in the gaming space? Absolutely. Obviously, I have a Steam Deck, and I like the Steam Deck. That runs on a version of Linux, SteamOS, and SteamOS is being made available to more devices, but frankly, I don't really see it ever becoming something that I can outright recommend as your primary gaming system. At least, not unless Microsoft suddenly decides to make the next version of Windows a subscription service and not give you the option to just buy a lifetime license like you can line with all the other versions of Windows up to this point. Which, of course, has been rumored and feared for a very long time, but I don't really see Microsoft ever being able to get away with that, considering that people would be in an absolute uproar if their subscription lapsed, for example, and suddenly they couldn't do anything with their computer. Now, of course, if Microsoft makes that unfathomably stupid decision, then, well, obviously that's going to be a different story. We're basically going to be forced to switch over to Linux. But until Linux gets the same level of support that Windows does for things like drivers and so on, I really don't see myself being able to recommend Linux to anybody from a gaming context. Or really just in general, actually. If you're a tech enthusiast, if you're somebody who is very comfortable using, say, DOS or other terminal interfaces, then maybe you should give Linux a shot, but for the average person, hell no. Next up, we have several questions from Everest Pictures, all of which are going to be fairly short here. First is my favorite instrument. I don't need to play it, just which one do I like the most? Probably a tie between electric guitar and drums. I kind of go back and forth depending on which particular song I'm listening to. Next up, favorite film genre. I actually don't really have a favorite genre of film. There's just a lot of genres that I really like, whether it be specific types of fantasy or sci-fi or film noir. I'm pretty fond of film noir. I'm a big fan of westerns, particularly spaghetti westerns. It's all over the place. It kind of depends on my mood. Next up, my favorite combat jet. And that's a pretty easy one. A-10 Warthog, because you can never have too much brrrr. Before you take to the comments and say, wait a minute, DW, A-10 Warthog isn't what I was talking about, you didn't specify the kind of combat jet. Anyway, moving on, we have my opinion on emojis in the sense that they're spreading like some new hieroglyphic script. I feel like that's one of those things I'm just too old to understand what you're talking about there. Emojis are something that's been around for quite a while, and they've been quite frequently used. I generally don't see people using them beyond maybe one or two of them in any particular statement in a text message. So I'm not entirely sure what you mean by this spreading as some sort of script in and of itself. But if you'll allow this language nerd to do language nerd things here, this is one that a lot of people get wrong, but there's actually no such thing as a type of script referred to as hieroglyphic. Hieroglyphs and hieroglyphic only refer to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, those specific characters that the ancient Egyptian language used. The type of script you're really referring to here in the case of emojis would be either logographic or ideographic, although it may go into a bit more of a pictographic script depending on which language you speak and whether you're actually using any of the sounds associated with that emoji rather than just the idea of the emoji itself. Anyway, don't mind me, just language nerd things. Moving on to a language nerd question, why did I learn German? I feel like I might have answered this question before, but I'll go ahead and answer it again. Primarily because I have a lot of German heritage, and I just wanted to get more in touch with that. And thankfully it was an option for me, because it has worked out pretty well. Anyway, moving on to the next question, and continuing the trend of languages and globetrotting and such. Out of all the foreign countries I've been to, which one impressed me the most? Now keep in mind that I haven't been to all that many countries simply because I haven't really had the opportunity for it. And obviously I can't really count countries that I was just passing through and didn't really stop and take in the sights and such in, like Liechtenstein. But out of the countries that I can actually say I have visited, which are Canada, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy, I liked Switzerland the most. It is an absolutely beautiful country, and the people I was interacting with were very friendly, very pleasant, and it was just a great time all around. But while it was a really nice place to visit, and I would love to visit it again someday, I can definitely tell you I wouldn't want to live there, because I was there on an organized trip, so everything for lunches and stuff was included. But of course, if we wanted a drink or snack or something like that outside of the already paid for meals, then we had to get those for ourselves, and hoo boy was everything expensive there, so I definitely wouldn't want to live there, let's put it that way. But very nice place to visit. Anyway, continuing the Mr. Worldwide thing here, my opinion on in-game content differences depending on regions in the world. That depends a lot on what kind of regional differences we're talking about here. A lot of times, developers will make some fairly innocuous changes between different regions. Things like changing the name of something. For example, in Japan, the Resident Evil series is referred to as the Biohazard series. And of course, there might be differences in the way the logos are presented, because they might work really well if they're in one language, but not necessarily as well in a different one. So they might change up the logo a bit. And sometimes they'll try to localize things to certain regions a bit better. For example, there's just certain things in Japanese culture that really don't translate all that well to other languages and cultures. Prime example of that is stuff like the use of the Kansai dialect in Japanese media to immediately note that a character is supposed to be some sort of country bumpkin, which is a bit ironic considering that the Kansai region is pretty heavily populated and has cities like Osaka and Kyoto in it, and I don't think most people would consider folks from Kyoto or Osaka to be country bumpkins. Anyway, there's just this long-running meme, effectively, of Japanese media using the Kansai dialect to mean that a character is from the boonies. And that doesn't really translate all that well to most other languages, so you don't normally see that reflected in, say, English dubs, or even something like a German dub. You could kind of make it work in a German dub by having the character speak Bavarian, for example. But honestly, Bavarian is much more different from standard German than the Kansai dialect is from standard Japanese, so you don't really get the same kind of equivalency there. And obviously there's just not really an equivalency at all in the English language. Another prime example is stuff like the overly polite form that characters speak in, where you'll hear characters ending a lot of sentences with de gozaru. Now, gozaru is the very formal form of the verb to be. It's usually only used in the context of arigatou gozaimasu in modern Japanese. Arigatou gozaimasu meaning thank you. You can put parentheses on very much, because it is a very polite way of saying thank you. If you just want to say thank you in a more casual context, you would just say arigato or domo. But actually making a lot more use of gozaru is a way of denoting that a character is either really old-fashioned or just being overly polite at all times. And you'll also see it a lot to denote characters who are based on a more samurai ethos or a ronin ethos in media that's not necessarily a period drama, and you will hear it a lot in period dramas specifically. But of course, English in particular, but I think most Western languages really don't really have an equivalent of the gozaru form. There's certainly some more polite ways of speaking, but not with the same kind of cultural tone that something like the gozaru form has. So that tends to be one of those noticeable regional differences where certain things in, say, Japanese media just don't translate well or really even at all into Western media, so you get that distinction between the versions right from the get-go. And that's just assuming that the translation is faithful to the original game, because in more recent times, a lot of so-called localizers have decided that they just want to make the story and characters whatever they feel like injecting into the game. And as a prime example there, look at something like Fire Emblem Fates, where the translators in the English version didn't actually translate certain lines from the Japanese version into English, and instead straight up replaced them, resulting in scenes that just don't have anywhere near the same weight that the original Japanese versions do, or sometimes even completely change entire scenes so that you end up with characters doing and saying things that are either utterly ridiculous or even sometimes just straight up undermine their characters, or make the characters completely different to how they were in the original Japanese. That kind of thing is just incredibly egregious and is downright unforgivable, because I would consider that straight up mangling the original work. It's one thing if you run across a statement that is a very idiomatic thing in one language, but it just doesn't translate to other languages, and so instead of just translating whatever it was directly and the meaning being lost, you go out of your way to find something that is at least culturally very close to what the original intent was and implement that instead. So just to give an example of what that might end up being, if you cross your fingers in English, that means you're hoping for good fortune, but that doesn't translate to other cultures. For example, if you were to translate that into German culture, directly translating a sentence like "I'm crossing my fingers" wouldn't really work. It wouldn't make any sense in German culture. But if you translated it into "Ich drücke die Daumen," which is "I am pressing my thumbs," then it would actually make sense, because that's what Germans do, for example, when they're hoping for good fortune. Instead of crossing their fingers, they press their thumbs. That's an example of not directly translating the words of something, but translating the intent. That kind of thing is perfectly fine. In fact, it's preferable when you're doing a proper localization. But unfortunately, a fair amount of localizers these days have no interest in doing a proper translation and localization. They would rather just inject their own personal politics into things, or rewrite characters and scenes to suit their whims rather than actually translate the original intent of the work, and that's just downright despicable. Then, of course, there's localizations that are either simply incompetent or just hilariously wrong, like, say, changing onigiri in Pokemon to being donuts in the American version, because they figured that American audiences would have no idea what onigiri are, and admittedly, most Americans don't know what onigiri are, but changing them to donuts is just downright silly. Then, of course, there is straight-up censorship that occurs between various regions. Sometimes this is done because of local regulations. Prime example there being Germany and its laws against depicting any kind of Nazi imagery in things that are either not given artistic exemptions or documentary exemptions. So it's fine to show that kind of thing in, say, an actual documentary, or a film, or a TV show, or something like that, because it's considered artistic. But in video games' case, for a very long time, they were not considered an artistic medium, so they were treated as effectively toys. And thus any depiction of the so-called funny mustache man, or swastikas, or the SS logo, or any number of things like that, either had to be changed or removed for the game to be sold in the German market. And then when you combine that with regulations on depictions of violence, you end up with the actual blood and gore and violence in video games being censored, with things like the infamous version of Counter-Strike for the German market, where instead of you shooting an enemy and them falling over dead, they would drop their weapon, put their hands behind their head, and then get on their knees. Or, of course, the infamous German version of Team Fortress 2, where the characters weren't actually flesh and blood like they are in, well, every other region as far as I know. Instead, they're all robots, all of the blood is oil, and when you blast an enemy into what was meaty chunks in other versions, they would explode into robot components and springs and such like that. That kind of thing is all just utterly ridiculous, and thankfully in Germany's case, they have lightened up on that considerably over the past several years. So now, as long as the game is appropriately age-rated, you can have pretty much as much blood and gore in the game as you want, although Nazi imagery does still get pretty heavily censored in the German releases. But the especially frustrating thing about something like that is that it affects more than the region in which the actual laws are effective. So those laws are in effect in Germany. But Germany isn't the only country in Europe that speaks German. There's also Austria and Switzerland. And a lot of developers and publishers aren't going to maintain separate versions for Austria and Switzerland versus Germany. They're just going to have the general German language version. So even though those laws aren't on the books in Austria, a lot of times Austrians still get saddled with the censored version of the game anyway. I do think that the Swiss don't have to worry about that quite as much, considering they have 4 national languages, not just German. So they might get access to a multilingual international version rather than just the German version like the German and Austrian markets tend to get. I'm not really sure there though, so if there's anybody in my audience who's Swiss, feel free to enlighten me on that. But as for Austrians, unfortunately they still get saddled with censored versions of games a lot of times anyway, simply because a lot of developers and publishers don't maintain separate German language versions for Germany itself and other German-speaking territories. But while most content changes are either going to occur because of cultural differences that need to be translated, or particular laws and regulations in a country requiring that certain content be censored. Sometimes content differs based on differences in hardware between different regions. Prime example there being Famicom games tend to sound different than NES games because the Famicom had extra sound chips available in the cartridges that weren't available in NES versions, and because the Famicom versions of these particular games just had more advanced sound chips in them, a lot of times they will actually just sound straight up better than the NES versions. And then sometimes the hardware was only released in a specific region, so games that require that hardware aren't available in other regions, or if they are available in other regions, they don't have any of the features associated with that hardware. Those kinds of differences sometimes can be a bit disappointing to deal with, but usually they're just interesting more than anything else. So, yeah, a bit of a long-winded answer there, but I guess to sum that up, what do I think about regional differences in games? Depends largely on the kind of differences we're talking about here. Anyway, moving on, we have the final question in this battery from Everest Pictures, which is Pepsi or RC Cola or Coca-Cola or dihydrogen monoxide? Although I do have to admit that I actually inserted the RC Cola because the original question had something else in there that didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, so I said, do you actually mean RC Cola? And Everest said, you know what, we'll go with that. Just go with RC Cola. Anyway, to answer that question is another it depends on the situation. If we're talking about which cola-flavored soda do I generally prefer drinking, then it's basically just whatever the place that I'm getting the drink from has on hand. If I'm drinking just a basic cola-flavored soda, then I don't really care one way or another whether it's Coca-Cola, Pepsi, or RC, or even just a generic store brand or something. And that's because I actually just prefer other kinds of soda. More specifically, if I have the option of drinking cherry Dr. Pepper, then I'm pretty much always going to opt for a cherry Dr. Pepper. But I can't always get cherry Dr. Pepper, so if I'm, say, out and about and I stop by a fast food place to get a value meal or something and I'm looking at their drink menu, usually I'm going to opt for either a Dr. Pepper or a cherry Coke or cherry Pepsi, depending on which they have. And I don't really care one way or another about whether it's Pepsi or Coca-Cola. They do taste different, don't get me wrong, but I don't really prefer one over the other. Because again, normally I prefer drinking cherry Dr. Pepper or just Dr. Pepper in general. Now, all that said, drinking a lot of soda is a really bad habit, and I've been trying to cut back on that more recently because more often than not, I just don't need any caffeine, and I don't really want to be consuming a whole lot of sugar. So if I'm in a situation where I'm not going to benefit from being perked up by sugar and caffeine, like say if I'm trying to wind down for the night and get some rest, or I've got plenty of energy as is and I'm just feeling thirsty, then I do just try to drink plain old water, although I have this weird psychosomatic thing where I just don't like drinking room temperature or hot water. So if for whatever reason I don't have access to cold water, but I do have access to hot water, then I might just brew some tea instead. And while we're on the subject of brewed drinks, because I know some people might follow this up with a question about coffee, I don't drink coffee. And that's because while I do like the smell of coffee, I really don't like the flavor of it, and more importantly, it tends to give me some really nasty heartburn. Anyway, I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I hope that answers your question. Next we have a question from Neil, which is, I seem to know a lot about guns, where did I learn? It depends on what we're talking about here. If we're just talking about general knowledge, well, I grew up in an area where a lot of people hunt, so I was just around them my whole life. But aside from that, I just find historical arms and armor interesting, whether it's firearms or things like swords or axes or pole arms or whatever. So I might be visiting a museum, for example, and find something that seemed really interesting, and what information they had at the museum may not necessarily be enough to satisfy my curiosity, so I might go look and see if there were books on it. Or of course, once the internet became more of a thing, there would be channels on YouTube, for example, that would cover really interesting historical arms and armor and such. So, prime example of that would be stuff like the Royal Armories channel or Forgotten Weapons. And interestingly enough, as I've gotten more and more interested in storytelling and role-playing games and such like that, I've actually expanded my knowledge a lot more, because sometimes you'll come across something like GURPS where they have hilariously complicated weapon lists, and a lot of them are things that you've never heard of, so you just start looking up and like, oh, that's really cool. Or I might be watching a movie or a TV show and see something that I'm not familiar with and be like, oh, what's that? And I'll look it up on IMFDB and be like, oh, that's really cool, let's look into this and see what this is about. Or I might be writing something up for one of my tabletop games and think, okay, well, what would make sense for, say, this region or for this character to be carrying? And even if it's something that doesn't necessarily make all that much sense, is it something that makes that character more unique? And so over the years, I've just absorbed an awful lot of information about an awful lot of arms and armor related things. And when it comes to consuming media, that has been both a blessing and a curse, because when I see things done right, then I really appreciate the attention to detail, but when I see things done poorly, then it really annoys me. And that actually leads into the next question, which is from Pack Mikey, and it is, how important do I find first-person animation in FPS games? If a game has floaty and janky reload animations, for example, does it jeopardize the rest of the experience? The answer there is that it's a severe blemish on the game's presentation, but it doesn't necessarily ruin the entire experience. I mean, for example, the Stalker games are not ruined by how god-awful their animations are. They've got considerably worse things to worry about than that. However, in any game that is striving for some sort of authenticity or realism, or any game that is using actual real-world weapons depicted in the game, if they're not being handled properly, then anybody who actually knows anything about how those firearms work is just going to start cringing immediately. But something I find far worse than simply really bad weapon handling is when you have a lack of consistency with the animations. And this is the result of something changing pretty dramatically on the part of the developer. A couple of prime examples here are Squad 44, which is what used to be called Postscriptum, and Killing Floor 2. Now, Killing Floor 2, I've made a video on quite a long time ago at this point, but it has absolutely phenomenal weapon handling animations. They went really far out of their way to make sure that there's tons of detail packed into them, and so they look great, especially in slow motion, which is one of the main reasons they put so much detail into those animations. But then Tripwire Interactive decided to move on to other projects, and they left basically a skeleton crew putting out updates for the game. And sometimes those updates included some new content, so you ended up with the G36C and the FAMAS, which have utterly atrocious animations. And when you put them side by side with how good the other animations are, it is so glaringly obvious that it always completely takes you out of the experience. Meanwhile, when you look at the animations in something like Squad 44, you can very easily tell which animations were handled by the current development team versus which ones were handled by the original Postscriptum development team. Because if you're not familiar with what was going on there, Offworld Industries, the developer of Squad, and now that Starship Troopers first-person shooter as well, ended up purchasing Postscriptum and turning it into Squad 44, and started putting out updates for it again, and that included new content, which had animations that were either reused from Squad, or were made for Squad 44, but look very, very different from the way the weapons were animated in the original Postscriptum. So you'll notice that the original Postscriptum animations tend to be a bit jittery, for lack of a better way of describing them, whereas the new animations from the Squad developers don't really have that problem. However, at the same time, they don't always match up exactly to the way the real weapons would have handled, so that can be kind of awkward too. Now, all that said, the main things I am looking for when it comes to first-person animations are things that help me connect to the gameplay. So, the thing you need to understand about a first-person shooter is that the player's primary interaction with the world around them is to use whatever weapon they're currently holding to shoot at whatever enemies they're facing. So the developer's responsibility is to make those weapons feel good to use. How do they accomplish this? Well, first they have to make it feel like they're punching appropriately, so they gotta have the right amount of recoil, they've gotta have the right amount of on-screen presence, there has to be the right amount of muzzle flash or whatever the equivalent is, depending on what kind of weapon it is. And they have to feel like they have some actual weight to them. You don't want them to just kind of flop around the screen all the time like they're weightless. That last one in particular is one that a lot of developers struggle with, because a lot of game developers simply have no real experience with ranged weapons of any kind. And if your knowledge about how, say, a firearm works comes from movies and TV shows, well, you're going to be in for a world of problems when it comes to actually animating them, because you're going to do things like assume that they're not as heavy as they actually are, or that they don't have recoil, or that the recoil is either lessened or greater than it actually is. Or you might make assumptions about what a particular part of a firearm does, even though in reality it does something very different, and so you end up animating it completely incorrectly. And while that's not necessarily going to be a complete deal breaker for any particular first-person shooter, it does ultimately compromise the experience, and developers need to be mindful of that. Next up, we have a few questions from Trustworthy Worm. The first of which is, so what do I think would happen if the Flood were dipped in Fallout's FEV? Well, nothing good, I can tell you that, but, I don't actually know enough about the Flood off the top of my head to really know how it might affect them. Because the big thing about the Flood is that it's a parasitic organism, so what it actually does to things largely depends on what it ends up attaching itself to. And I can't remember offhand if there's anything in the Fallout lore that is a parasitic organism affected by the FEV. It's also entirely possible that absolutely nothing would happen if you dip the Flood into FEV, so it's just hard to say. I don't really think there's enough in established lore to really be able to answer that question all that well, so sorry if this sounds a bit wishy-washy there. Next question is a bit of an interesting one because it's kind of a history nerd question. Do I think a video game about the Coal Wars would ever work? The thing is, I don't want to say no on that because it would depend on the kind of game we're talking about here. Because for those of you who don't know what the Coal Wars were, which is probably most of you, it was a series of labor conflicts between the late 1800s and the 1930s or so, primarily in Appalachia, with probably the most famous of the events being in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, where coal companies were trying to suppress efforts by their workers to unionize, and it eventually turned violent. You actually had straight-up battles being fought between the coal workers and the armed thugs employed by the coal companies to violently suppress any kind of attempts to unionize. There's a lot of really interesting history there, and unfortunately it's getting lost both to time and neglect, because American history courses don't cover it, and the regions in which these events took place are very poor, so people are primarily trying to get out of them to seek better economic opportunities, so less and less of that history is really being preserved as time goes on. And that's just sad. But to bring it back to the question at hand here, do I think it could work as a video game? Well, I do think that a video game could be set in the Coal Wars, but I don't really know what kind of video game would work best. I can tell you that a lot of the typical genres you might think of for any kind of armed conflict, like first or third person shooters or real-time or turn-based strategy games, would be in fairly poor taste here. But something like an adventure game might work. It's hard to say for sure, though, and I really don't see any companies trying to make a game set in the Coal Wars because, to put it simply, I don't really see any game developers being able to treat that kind of material with respect unless they specifically come from Appalachia. And unfortunately, I just don't really see that happening. Maybe some indie developer will get the idea to make a game set in the Coal Wars and will treat it with respect, and it'll actually be a really interesting game. But it's a pretty tight niche in American history that most people don't even really know anything about, so it would be one major uphill battle to get something like that to be a success. Maybe even an up-mountain battle. Anyway, moving on to another similar question here on difficult subject matter to make a game out of. Do I think that, whether AAA or indie, there will ever be a video game about border patrol akin to Battlefield Hardline? Well, I'm not going to say that it will absolutely never happen because I can't predict the future there. But what I can say is that I definitely don't see that happening with the current political climate in the US. And whether the studio is AAA or indie, nobody really wants to open that can of worms right now. Next up, we have a couple of questions from Dachshund Dog Starlight 19, which starts with, what is my overall opinion on the Shrek films and the franchise as a whole, especially the spin-off movies? Well, I can't really say too much about the spin-off movies because I haven't seen them. The only movies in the series I have seen are the first two Shrek films. And I like them both. I did like the first Shrek movie better than the second one, of course. But while they're certainly fun, fairy tale, fantasy, comedy movies, they're not exactly the kind of thing I immediately would jump to if I'm in the mood for a sort of fairy tale-esque fantasy comedy. That's more the realm of The Princess Bride. And his second question here has a bit of preamble, which is that he managed to watch the Attack on Titan anime once again from start to finish and found out it has the most contrived story he's ever seen, and he no longer liked it like he did back then. So the question for me is, what are my thoughts on the anime, especially its ending, and is it any better than the original manga or about the same? So kind of a combo question there, and one that has a slightly convoluted answer. Because I can't really comment on the anime itself as I haven't seen it. I've seen a few clips here and there, but I have not watched it all the way through, and I have absolutely no intention of watching Attack on Titan all the way through, because right around when Attack on Titan was becoming popular, the subscription service Loot Crate sent out a combo box, effectively, of Attack on Titan and Titanfall goodies, and one of the things included in that was actually the first volume of the Attack on Titan manga. Now, I didn't have a Loot Crate subscription, but somebody I know did have it, and they have absolutely no interest in anime and manga whatsoever, but they know I have interest in it, so they're like, hey, here's this volume of manga that I'm not going to do anything with, would you like it? And I'm like, sure, why not? I'll give it a read, it's popular, we'll see if it's any good. It was terrible. Just absolutely nothing to hook the reader other than pure shock value. Just sudden, gruesome violence occurring and pretty much anybody dying at any time. It was just such an utterly schlocky, poorly written mess that once I finished that volume, I was like, no, I'm not reading any more of this, and I'm certainly not going to watch the anime. And so to answer your question about what my thoughts on the anime are, I don't really have any thoughts on the anime itself, because I haven't seen it, and I have absolutely no intention of watching it, and what I read of the manga it's based on was absolutely terrible and completely turned off any interest I could have possibly had in Attack on Titan, so funnily enough, it's a prime example of simply not being media worth consuming even if you're able to consume it for free. So yeah, hope that answers your question there. Next up, we have a few questions from the Alan Reviews, starting with, what genres of music do I enjoy listening to? Well, it largely depends on what I happen to be in the mood for, but if we're talking just general genres of music, then there's a lot of classic rock, in particular stuff from the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of heavy metal, again, particularly stuff from the 70s and 80s, then there's a crap load of soundtracks from various movies, TV shows, and video games, there's a fair amount of orchestral and classical music, there's some pop music, particularly stuff from the 80s, and then there's a smattering of electronic and techno music, so we're talking mainly stuff like Daft Punk and Scooter, but there's a mixture of stuff in there. I'm fond of synthwave, for example. And then I've also got a playlist full of folk music, which is mainly sea shanties and more traditional, almost medieval, in fact, in a lot of cases, outright medieval music that is continued on to this day. And then there's a very small amount of hip-hop and rap as well. Really, there's not a whole lot of music genres that I don't listen to at least some of. I guess the only real exception there would be country music. Generally speaking, I absolutely despise country music, although there are a very select few songs and groups that I will listen to on occasion, if you can even consider them country. I mean, to give you an example, I really wouldn't consider the Charlie Daniels Band to be country, but they tend to be lumped in there an awful lot. But as for actual country music, whether it be traditional country music or the more modern pop country, I guess is the way you would describe it, don't like any of that stuff. There are a few individual songs here and there that I do like. For example, I generally can't stand most of Johnny Cash's stuff, but I do happen to like his rendition of God's Gonna Cut You Down. So there are a very, very small number of country songs like that I do like, but they're so few and far between that you can't consider me to listen to the genre of country music, let's put it that way. And that covers most of what I listen to. If any of you are interested in more specific stuff that I listen to, then feel free to ask. Anyway, moving on to the next question from the Alan Reviews. What are my thoughts on the removal of H-Hour Worlds Elite from Steam? Now, I would imagine that most of my audience probably doesn't know what that is, so I'll go ahead and explain what it is before I give my thoughts on that. So for those of you who don't know what H-Hour Worlds Elite was, it was a tactical third-person shooter that was meant to be some sort of spiritual successor to the PlayStation-exclusive series SOCOM US Navy SEALs, and more specifically the multiplayer component of that, because frankly the multiplayer is the only thing people actually remember about those games. And before you ask, I do have copies of most of those games, and I will be taking a look at them at some point. Anyway, H-Hour was supposed to be a sort of spiritual successor to those games, and it was successfully kickstarted and then went through development hell for quite a few years until eventually, with the game still being unfinished, the company ended up ceasing operations and removed the game from Steam. So that catches you up on what we're talking about here, and the simple reality is I don't really care one way or another about it. I don't have any attachment to the series that it's a spiritual successor to, considering they were all PlayStation exclusives, and I hadn't played any of them until many, many years after they were even slightly relevant. So it really isn't all that possible for me to be disappointed with it being removed from Steam and never being finished. But it is still unfortunate. It's unfortunate that the game never got finished. It's unfortunate that it had to be removed from sale, but that's not exactly surprising. I mean, if the company that makes the game ceases operations, then it's not really surprising when their games get removed from sale. So yeah, I don't really know if you were expecting me to be mad about it or something, but mainly I'm just fairly ambivalent towards it. Anyway, moving on to the last question the Allen Reviews had for this particular Q&A. Did I create and edit the videos and thumbnails on my channel? That's a fairly bewildering question, but when I thought about it, I realized, oh, you're probably wondering if I have somebody who makes the thumbnails, if I have somebody who edits my videos or something like that. And the answer is also going to explain why it often takes me so long to get videos done. Unless specifically stated in the video and video description box, I do all that stuff myself, which is also why you don't usually see me including a lot of special effects or throwing in memes or anything like that. The more of that kind of stuff you add to a production, the more work intensive it is, and I have very limited time and energy to work on videos, so in order to try to keep things manageable, I try to keep things pretty simple and straightforward in that regard. And moving on to a question from JDOS that is related to this question, what tools, equipment, and software do I use to make and edit videos? So that's going to consist of the software I use to record my commentary, which is Audacity, and then it's also going to include what I use to record gameplay footage. Now that can be a few different programs depending on my needs. Now for console gameplay footage, I use an Elgato HD60 to capture the gameplay footage, but for PC games, I have a few options for recording gameplay footage. The one I tend to use the most is Shadowplay, which is NVIDIA's solution for recording gameplay footage, and it has a very low impact on the graphics card, which is why I like using it. But if I'm messing with something that just doesn't work with Shadowplay at all, or the footage ends up coming out weird, then I might use OBS instead. And then for the video editing software, currently I'm using Vegas Pro, and it's still working out pretty well for me, so I don't really see any reason to switch away from it anytime soon. Next up, we have a few questions from the Brodator, starting with, what are my thoughts on the walking sections in Sony games? Those sections where you just walk while characters talk to you. Do they add immersion, or do they just hurt replay value? Well, just a quick note before I actually answer the question, it's not just Sony games that do this. That's been a thing for quite a long time. Sony games are probably the most prominent examples of it in the last several years, but it's a widespread thing throughout the entire industry, and it never ceases to be incredibly annoying. They are just about the most pointless thing you can put into any kind of story-driven video game. It's effectively a cutscene. Just remove the interactivity from it. There's no reason to have it if quite literally all you're doing is walking forward, or maybe pressing a single button at some point. It's really just an excuse to force the player through these sections if they want to finish the game without being able to skip what is otherwise just a cutscene. And it continually baffles me how developers who use this technique never seem to be able to comprehend that if we wanted to sit there and watch things happen, we would watch TV shows or movies. We would not be playing a video game. We do not play video games to hold the left stick forward or hold the W key while we get talked to. At the very least, if you are going to include something like this, make it more interesting from a gameplay perspective. Give the players puzzles to solve or something like that. Don't just have them slowly trudging forward by holding the left stick or the W key. Because if all you're doing is walking forward very slowly while characters talk to you, then that's just a complete waste. Just turn that into a cutscene, because that's all it is. And if you choose to make it as minimally interactive as holding the W key or the left stick forward, then all you're really doing is padding out the length of the game, and that's never going to be anything other than irritating. So just don't do it. Not that the developers will ever listen, of course. They've got delusions of grandeur, thinking that they can make these sweeping cinematic experiences, which is just about the opposite of what gaming is good at. Anyway, moving on to the next question. Are there any games I would like Night Dive to do a remaster of? I mean, the obvious one there is going to be No One Lives Forever. And of course, while they're at it, also do No One Lives Forever 2 and Contract Jack. Although I certainly wouldn't want to see Contract Jack as a standalone game. I would want it bundled together with No One Lives Forever 2. Because in case you don't know, Contract Jack is actually a spin-off of No One Lives Forever 2. But anyway, point here is that that would be the most obvious one. Another obvious one would be Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight along with Mysteries of the Sith. And then, of course, there's a whole host of other games that I think would be really cool if Night Dive was able to remaster them. Things like the old-school Rainbow Six games, because Rainbow Six 1 as well as Rogue Spear are just a pain to get running on modern systems properly. And, of course, Ubisoft just doesn't support those at all. Hell, even Rainbow Six 3, which is easier to get running on modern systems than the first two games, is still janky and weird on modern systems, so it would be nice to see some remasters of stuff like that. And, you know what, while we're at it, let's just throw some other wacky stuff into the mix, like the Mech Warrior games. I would love to see those brought back. Although I believe there's some rights issues from the mech designs with the original Mech Warrior game, and Mech Warrior 2 is a DOS game, so that's still fairly easy to get running these days. But Mech Warrior 3 and 4 really don't like modern systems all that well, so they can be a real pain in the ass to get running properly as well. So it'd be really nice to see Mech Warrior 3 and 4 brought back in particular, but also the first two. And of course there's some relatively obscure games out there. I wouldn't mind seeing them bring back stuff like Drakon Order of the Flame, along with its sequel, The Ancient's Gates, which actually was only available on console, even though the first game was a PC game, weirdly enough. And of course it'd be nice to see remasters, or at least re-releases of stuff like the Heretic and Hexen games, because Heretic 2 in particular has just not been available for a long time, and while you can still get digital versions of Hexen, the Death Kings of the Dark Citadel expansion for Hexen, as well as Hexen 2, you can't get the expansion pack for Hexen 2 digitally, which, given how expensive physical copies of that are getting, is incredibly annoying. Anyway, I better go ahead and stop with this particular question there, because I could probably go on about this for quite a while. There's a lot of games out there that would be really neat if they were remastered, and of course, Night Dive can't be doing all of them. They just don't have the time or resources for that. So let's go ahead and move on to the last question from the Brodator for this particular video, which is, are there any games that I like that I can admit are objectively bad? Sure, Ride to Hell Retribution. That game is terrible. It is the worst game I've ever covered on the channel. I gave it a 0 out of 5. But let's face it, you really can't deny that it's freaking hilarious. It really is a prime example of something that is just so utterly atrocious that you can't help but find it entertaining. That's not really the case with most of these bad games, though. Most bad games are just boring or are just irritating. They're not enjoyable. So I do have a hard time thinking about the games that are just legitimately awful, but I actually somehow enjoy them anyway. So sorry if that answer comes across as a bit non-committal, but the simple fact of the matter is that most of the games I enjoy because they're good, not because they're bad. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to a few questions from Jordan DCG, starting with one that's actually related to the question I just answered about bad games that I enjoy, which is, are there any noteworthy games that I've either loved or hated at first, then eventually thought otherwise? So he gives the examples of Twisted Metal 3 and Max Payne 3, where he didn't like them at first, but now they're in his top 5 games. You know, now that I think about it, I can come up with plenty of games that are more or less the exact opposite of that, where I initially enjoyed them, but upon revisiting them, I realized that I don't like them anywhere near as much as I thought I did. Or even some instances where I initially played the game and thought I enjoyed it because of some particular aspect of it, and then when I revisit it later on down the line, I realized that that particular thing I thought I liked about it enough to carry the whole experience didn't actually carry the whole experience, and I ended up really not liking it at all. And I can also think of a few games that I initially enjoyed, but upon revisiting them later with more knowledge and experience, I actually ended up appreciating them even more. But weirdly enough, I actually can't think of any games off the top of my head that initially I really disliked, and then when I revisited them later, I turned out to actually enjoy them. Usually it's been more a matter of stuff like what happened with The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, where initially I effectively forced myself to enjoy that game because, damn it, I was going to get my money's worth out of it, and then when I revisited it later on down the line with a computer that can actually run it, I was just struck by how ultimately crap that game is. But even situations like that are rather uncommon, so most of the time when I mess around with a game and then mess around with it later, whatever I thought about it in that initial stage usually holds up when I get to the replay later on down the line. There may be some things that really annoy me these days, but I'm kind of willing to put up with if it's a particularly old game like interface and control problems. But it's rather rare that something like that is enough to completely deter me from enjoying the game again. But as for incredibly strong shifts where I go from really enjoying something to really despising it, or vice versa, I really can't think of much off the top of my head there. The closest that comes to that is The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, and frankly, I didn't enjoy Oblivion that much even when I did force myself to enjoy it. Even back then, it absolutely paled in comparison to my enjoyment of Morrowind. So I hope that answers your question there. Now let's move on to Jordan's next question, which is unrelated to video games. It is my favorite food, dessert, and snack of all time. Weirdly enough, two parts of that are a bit difficult to answer. My favorite snack is just sour cream and onion potato chips, or crisps for those of you across the pond. But yeah, if I get a bag of sour cream and onion potato chips, then I can just scarf the entire thing down within the span of basically a couple of days. And that is incredibly quick for me to consume an entire bag of snack food. Usually it takes me at least a week or two. But as for the other two questions, my favorite food, I'm assuming we mean an entree of some sort, and dessert. Well, I don't actually consume dessert all that much. I'm not really big into sweet foods. I'm usually more into savory foods, which means that while snacks will certainly apply and just general entree items will apply, I just don't eat a whole lot of desserts, even when it is something that I normally enjoy. I guess if we go by the dessert item that I consume the most of, then it would probably be cookies and cream ice cream. So, basically like an Oreo Blizzard if you go to Dairy Queen or something like that. But as for my favorite kind of entree, well, that's where things get a bit murkier. Because as I've gotten older, my idea of a favorite food has just kind of dissipated entirely. There's still plenty of foods that I would consider among my favorites, but I wouldn't consider any one of them to be the favorite anymore. So weirdly enough, the answer is going to change depending on what kind of food I'm really in the mood for. Sometimes it might be fried chicken, sometimes it might be specific kinds of burgers, sometimes it might be biscuits and gravy, which for those of you across the pond who are immediately conjuring an image of sweet cookies with brown gravy slathered all over them, that is not what that is. Biscuits in this context are more like what the Brits would call scones. They're a savory bread type thing. And the gravy is what you would describe as a cream gravy. So it's more like a bechamel sauce, but not with that kind of spicing in it. It's usually a lot thicker, usually has pork sausage in it, and it is absolutely delicious, a wonderful comfort food. And if you've never tried it, you should definitely try it. Anyway, sometimes I might be really in the mood for that. Sometimes I might be really in the mood for fish. In fact, a lot of times I'm really in the mood for fish. But anyway, point is that depending on whatever I'm in the mood for, I might say that that particular item is my favorite food at this point. I've found that just the older I get, the more I expand my palate, the less I even remotely care about having any kind of favorite foods or anything like that. The only real exception there is the sour cream and onion chips. Those have just remained my favorite kind of snack food since as far as I can remember. So, sorry about being a bit wishy-washy on the answer here, but unfortunately in this situation, that's just how it is. Anyway, let's move on to the next question, which is, regardless of the poor track record, is there a favorite film, TV show, or book of mine that I think would make a great game if it was in the right hands? So by poor track record, I'm guessing you mean the track record of most video game adaptations of various books, movies, TV shows, etc. are just awful. So, assuming that the game gets put in the right hands, they do the source material justice, and it turns out to be an actually legitimately really good game, what do I think would actually make a really good video game? Well, funnily enough, most of the various media franchises, I guess you could call them, that I'm into, have already been adapted into video games at some point or another. Whether it be stuff like Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, H.P. Lovecraft's works, Robert E. Howard's works like Conan, various comic book characters, RoboCop, Terminator, pretty much whatever you can think of has probably been adapted into a video game at some point. And even if it hasn't necessarily directly been adapted into a video game, a lot of them have heavily inspired things. And in some of those cases, it feels like actually making a video game in the way that I think would work best for that franchise would end up producing the thing that it inspired in the first place. So a prime example there would be Firefly. It's never actually had a video game adaptation as far as I'm aware. I know there was supposed to be an MMO a while back, but that never actually materialized. So we've never actually had a video game set in the Firefly universe, but we have had plenty of games inspired by Firefly. I play one of them all the time, which is RimWorld, but when I think of Firefly, I don't necessarily think of just the setting elements that heavily inspired RimWorld. I think of a tightly knit crew going on various adventures around the verse, just basically seeing what kind of trouble they can get into. And when I try to conjure up an image of how that would work in gameplay, I more or less just come up with Mass Effect. So I guess that's the answer to your question there. I basically want a Mass Effect style game, but it's set in the Firefly universe. Now we move on to the final question from Jordan for this particular video, which is there a particular type of board or video game I've been wanting to make for a while that either haven't had the time or funds yet to do so? Any details I could share? Well, there are a couple of ideas I've had bouncing around in my head for a very long time, but they've never really made it past the idea stage. Because sometimes you'll have an idea and you'll think, that's a really cool idea, that would make a really cool video game, and then you start actually trying to think about how to make it work as a video game, and you come up with the realization that it actually probably wouldn't work as a video game. But one I do know would work because it's worked previously, and I would just want to do my own take on it and kind of more modernized version of it, is a game like Sentinel Worlds Future Magic, where you control a starship crew and you just go on adventures around the galaxy. Obviously, we've had a few games like that over the years, but I can't really think of anything that has specifically felt like Sentinel Worlds did. It just has this really specific vibe to it that has just never really been fully replicated, not even by the same developer making a sort of spiritual successor in the form of the game called Hard Nova. And funnily enough, I'll probably sound like a broken record here, but the closest thing we have gotten to a recreation of this style is, weirdly enough, the original Mass Effect. Because when you landed on a planet in Sentinel Worlds, you hop into your APC and you drive around the planet's surface. And in Mass Effect 1, you got the Mako, so you land on a planet, you hop in the Mako, you drive around the planet's surface. When you get out of the APC or you land at specific places in the galaxy in Sentinel Worlds, you get out of your vehicle and then you're wandering around the various environments as the crew members themselves. But then there's the one thing that Sentinel Worlds does that Mass Effect doesn't, which is you have control over your ship. So you can fly it around, you can engage in ship-to-ship combat, and it all works. You can also do boarding actions and such. And Mass Effect doesn't have that. It just has very scripted sections with regards to the Normandy. So while it gives a kind of similar vibe in some ways, it just doesn't recapture the same general feel of Sentinel Worlds. And I really can't think of another game off the top of my head that gives the same vibe that Sentinel Worlds does. So I would just like to see another game like that, whether I make it myself or somebody else makes it. I don't really care one way or the other on that. But it's an idea I've had bouncing around in my head for many, many years now, and, well, I've just never really been able to act on it. And funnily enough, this actually leads me into the next set of questions, which are from Yodestein, and that starts with, have I ever attempted to make a game? So, obviously I haven't attempted to make the Sentinel World style game. I've had the idea bouncing around in my head. But I have actually dabbled in game development over the years, but I haven't really ever been able to produce anything complete. It's mostly just been the process of me generally learning how to do programming back in the day, and so I would do things like code some very simple text adventures, so similar to Zork, or I would mess around a little bit with making a sort of point-and-click adventure game or a dungeon crawler or something like that, but never really get very far with it, just dabbling with it here and there as I learned how to program. And then there's another related question from Yodestein here, which is, have I ever tried or attempted to learn a game engine? And if so, which one? I mean, I've dabbled a bit with Unity, I've dabbled a bit with Unreal Engine. back when it was still Unreal Engine 3. And after id released the source code for Quake 1 and 2, I did poke around in those files just to see what was in the source code and just try to figure out how it worked. But as far as buckling down and learning how to program a game from the ground up in a particular engine, I haven't done any of that. Then we have the final question from Yodestein for this particular video, which is, any predictions on the future of AI and AI tools as it pertains to games, fears and hopes? Well, most of what we're seeing from AI tools when it comes to video game development is they're being used to produce lots of code, they're being used to produce images that are either being used as placeholders or they're then being finalized by whoever's doing the visual design of the game, if you can even call it that at that point. And in the AAA space, like with what we're seeing from Call of Duty these days, it's being used to generate just cosmetic items that look terrible and have basically no actual value. So as far as the fear side of that goes, I really do fear that we're going to be going into the age of AI slop, where people just throw whatever they feel like throwing into an ChatGPT or whatever, and then that produces code or images that they will then use in their games, and it's like an asset flip all over again, but potentially much worse. And of course the AAA industry is going to be trying to use it to cut down on jobs and such like that, so that's going to be a mess. But as far as hopes, well, honestly, with the way current AI tools are, I don't ever really see them being a direct positive for the players themselves. I see them being potentially useful for doing things like formatting and doing some proofreading on scripts. So, say you've got an initial draft of a script and you haven't had anybody proofread it yet, but you don't want to take up somebody's time. You throw it into, I don't know, ChatGPT or something, and say, here, proofread this just to make sure there aren't any grammatical errors or things like that. I can see that being useful because that's the main positive use I have seen from generative AI. But other than that, the only real positive I can think of for any kind of generative AI tool in game development is using it to produce incidental code or incidental dialogue, so background character dialogue. And the same kind of thing for AI-generated voices, which I know that's a really touchy subject too. But using AI voices as sort of background noise, so just the general chatter noises that you might hear when you go into an area that's not really anything distinct, but you don't actually need actors saying anything in those instances, so you just have an AI tool generate something like that for you. Or if you come across a character that only has one line and it's a really generic line, you don't really need to hire an actor for them, so you can just feed it into an AI and have them say that one line. So if all the character is saying is, "Move along, citizen," then it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to have an actor go out of their way to do that. Even with something like that, though, I really don't see AI being a positive influence on games or game development overall. And really, the current craze over AI just has me very concerned in general, because it's overall already having a pretty significantly negative impact on the world around us, and I really worry that it's only going to get worse from there. Next up, we have a couple of questions from The Shocker, one of which is related to a question I answered earlier, but isn't quite the same subject matter since the situation was very different in the case of H-Hour. But this is a fairly long question here. What do I think about publishers removing games from digital stores for no good reason, like how Sega did it with a ton of their games, how Epic did it with Unreal Tournament franchise, and how Rockstar removed the original PC versions of GTA 3, Vice City, San Andreas, and Max Payne 1? As far as he knows, none of these games had rights issues since these IPs are all owned by the previously mentioned publishers. Sometimes they release a remaster of them like Rockstar with GTA, or a collection like Sega with Sonic Origins, but sometimes those remasters or collections are buggier and not as good, and certain people prefer to play the original releases while other times they just don't even bother to bring them back, like Epic, for example. Or to use the other example you used, Sega, because they still haven't brought back the vast majority of the Genesis and Mega Drive games that they pulled from sale. So to simplify things, there are instances where a developer or publisher really doesn't have a choice but to remove a game, and those are usually licensing problems, particularly with regards to song licensing. The music industry is just obnoxious with its licensing agreements. So if a particular agreement ends up expiring, then the developer or publisher either has to replace that music or simply remove it if they want to keep the game available for sale. And by that point, a lot of developers and publishers, particularly publishers, will just pull the game from sale entirely because it's probably not making a whole lot of money for them at that point, and they just think that it's not worth bothering with. And that might have been part of what went into the decision to remove the original versions of GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas. But let's face it, Rockstar really removed those games from sale because they wanted to push their remastered version of those games that they, of course, charge a much higher price for, and funnily enough, it just ends up being a significantly worse version. Obviously, it's a cynical cash grab, it's obnoxious, and the same exact thing is happening with Max Payne 1, since they're getting the remakes of Max Payne 1, and I believe Max Payne 2 as well, coming out eventually. So they pulled the games from sale because they're like, oh, well, we can push the remake for a much higher price. Seriously, Rockstar is one of the greediest game companies out there. Whenever you see them make any kind of decision you would think is a boneheaded decision, they did it because they think they can make more money. And unfortunately, they can get away with it because it seems like if you put a Rockstar Games logo on the cover, then it just magically becomes something that can sell, at least these days anyway. If you go back in the day with something like Oni, then no, it doesn't sell very well. But now that we live in a post-GTA 5 and Red Dead Redemption 2 world, they can pretty much do whatever the hell they want and get away with it because the gaming public will just let them do it. Meanwhile, the only game that Epic even remotely cares about is Fortnite. They don't care about any of their back catalog at all, so it really wasn't all that surprising that they removed the Unreal games from sale. Although it is still a downright boneheaded decision, they could have easily just kept the games on GOG and Steam, and even though they wouldn't be making them very much money, they would still be getting a bit of money coming in from people buying them. But I do know they still had to do some sort of maintenance on the multiplayer infrastructure for Unreal Tournament 3 specifically, and at one point they were going to try to put out some sort of update or new version of Unreal Tournament 3 so that it would be on an updated infrastructure and everything, but eventually they just canned that project and removed all of the games from sale. I guess on the positive side, they did give the community their blessing to host the at least original Unreal Tournament, and Unreal 2 all for free, and have the community maintain those versions instead of Epic maintaining them. But they didn't extend the same courtesy for Unreal Tournament 2004 or Unreal Tournament 3, so those remain unavailable, bafflingly and somewhat infuriatingly, especially in the case of UT2K4, since that's the best game in the series. Although, hell, I still haven't forgiven them for canceling the Unreal Tournament Alpha, as they refer to it. It was what would have been Unreal Tournament 4. And in the version that they made available, it was shaping up really nicely, and they just decided, you know what, no, we're going to cancel this in favor of going all in on Fortnite. So, much like with Rockstar, they went where the money was, and, well, they've never really looked back since, and the company has only continued to get more irritating as time has gone on. And then there's Sega and what they did with their back catalog, and that actually seems to be a problem with Japanese game companies in general. They seem to think that their back catalog should just not be available anymore. And I've never really been able to figure out why, because some companies, like Square Enix, will re-release their games, but they're just bafflingly selective about which ones they bring back. I mean, think about the likes of, say, Star Ocean. If you go on Steam right now and you look up Star Ocean, the only games that are available are Star Ocean: The Last Hope, The Divine Force, and Second Story R. This means that if you're on PC, you can get the second, fourth, and sixth games in the series, but not the first, third, or fifth, because that makes sense. And considering that Blue Sphere only ever re-released on mobile phones in 2009, I'm pretty sure that they've forgotten Blue Sphere even exists. But that's just the kind of thing you run into with Japanese game companies. For some utterly baffling reason, they pick and choose which games they want to make available, and then the rest just sit in their archives in perpetuity until eventually somebody finally says, hey, maybe we should actually do something with this, maybe 20, 30 years down the line. And it's always baffled me, not only from just a general common sense standpoint, but also, of course, a gaming standpoint, but even just a basic financial standpoint. If you've got this thing sitting in your archive that's not actively making you money, why not put it out on the market again so that it can actively make you money? It seems like a no-brainer to me, but what do I know? I'm just a guy who has to go out of his way to find used copies of old games because they just never re-released them. Anyway, to steer this back to the actual question here, what do I think about publishers removing games from sale for seemingly arbitrary reasons? I think it's ridiculous and obnoxious, and it shouldn't happen, but of course, they're just going to do it anyway because they think that's how they're going to make more money somehow. And maybe it does in the short term, but it's at the cost of burning all kinds of customer goodwill, and that is not something that is easy to get back. So it just ends up being something that I constantly find myself facepalming at. Anyway, moving on to the second question from the shocker, it's kind of the opposite direction of that. What do I think about GOG's approach of bringing back old games like the old Resident Evil trilogy, Dino Crisis, Mortal Kombat, etc.? Well, it's simply awesome. They're actively trying to preserve gaming history and make it available for people at a reasonable price. Not only that, but they've pledged to continue supporting these games in the future, so if, say, the next version of Windows comes along or something like that, and we start running into more compatibility problems again, then they have pledged to continue looking into that and get everything fixed up so that you can actually continue to enjoy these games. That's all downright awesome. It is doing great work for games preservation, and I hope they stick with it into the future, because I have no way of knowing how the future is going to go, but if they continue to stick with this program and do continue to support the games that they're bringing back, then that is just downright fantastic. And now we move on to a question from Leo64, which is, do current-gen games focus too much on having orchestral mix in their soundtracks rather than being different genres? He goes on to say something that was a bit confusingly worded, but I think the gist of it is that he noticed this was a trend when older game series started going more to an orchestral style of music during the PS2 era, and stopped using whatever styles they were using in the 90s and very early 2000s. And yeah, that is definitely a trend. Way more games these days use orchestral music, and a lot of it tends to sound very samey these days. But there are a few main reasons that orchestral music gets used as much as it does. The first of them is that developers think including orchestral music will make their games seem more epic or more cinematic, because orchestral music is way more associated with films and to a lesser extent TV shows than it is video games, even though video games have been using orchestral music for a very long time. And since there are just so many developers that seem utterly desperate to be recognized by their film industry senpai, you see them trying to make their games more and more like movies these days, and it's just obnoxious. That's not to say that orchestral music is always a terrible choice for video games, because it's not a terrible choice. In fact, in many cases, it is a fantastic choice. The thing is that you need to understand there is a time and a place and a general vibe for every single type of music out there, and sometimes you make a game that is just far better served by blasting heavy metal or synthwave or even something like hip-hop and rap. And unfortunately, a lot of composers and sound designers just don't seem to understand that. They either are just utterly locked into whatever they're comfortable with, which in the case of composers is usually orchestral because that's what they get taught. So it does make sense that they would be most comfortable with orchestral music and wouldn't necessarily want to experiment with other genres. But unfortunately that does end up being a bit disappointing sometimes because you end up with a lot of orchestral music that sounds very similar to each other. At least there are some that understand you can still make music sound unique even if you are working within the scope of orchestral stuff. So you end up with the likes of, say, Ace Combat. I mean, if you think about the song Zero from Ace Combat Zero, even though it is an orchestral track, I don't think anybody would begrudge it being orchestral because in the context of the game and just in general, it sounds awesome. So orchestral music definitely has its place. It can definitely be a great asset for any particular game as long as it's something that fits the game really well. So the mere existence of orchestral music and the fact that it is very prominent now is not in itself a bad thing. It's the question of, would some of these games be better served by not having orchestral music and actually trying a different soundtrack instead? And unfortunately, we'll just never really know that, and I don't see the AAA industry in particular getting away from orchestral anytime soon. Because, again, they're just kind of locked in their ways. They think it's more cinematic, so they want to go with that. But I really do hope that we see more musical variation, particularly in the AAA space, because they're the ones that really need it. But when you look in the indie space, there's a lot of variation. When you look in even the AA space, there's still a fair amount of variation. So it's there. It's just not quite as prominent because the biggest games of the industry are those so-called cinematic experiences that opt for orchestral stuff. And I keep hoping that if more games that have alternate styles of soundtrack are successful, that we'll see more attempts at branching out. But with the way the industry is going, who knows on that. Anyway, let's move on to a couple of questions from Saki Monkey. Starting with a question that I honestly debated whether I wanted to answer it or not because I figured it would just be painfully obvious, but it's, do I have any hopes that the Elder Scrolls 6 will be good? I mean, think about it this way. How could anyone look at Bethesda's track record over the past couple of decades and say, yeah, Elder Scrolls 6 will actually be good? Their games have just continued to get worse and worse and worse with each subsequent release, although Starfield was at least nowhere near as terrible as Fallout 76, I will give them that. But it's become abundantly clear that they're just gonna haphazardly throw together some absolute garbage and shovel it out onto the market, and people will obviously buy it up in droves because it has the Elder Scrolls in the title. But will it actually be any good? Absolutely not. At least that's what I figure from now. If it actually somehow turns out to be good, I will be legitimately amazed. And if by some insane miracle it does actually turn out to be good, that will be reflected in my review. I know a lot of people think that I go into games immediately wanting to hate them, but I really don't. If Elder Scrolls 6 legitimately turns out to be good, then I will say it's good, but it's just probably not gonna happen, given how crap Bethesda has gotten. And moving on to the second question here, in games set in real history, do I think it's important to focus on historical accuracy? He went on to give an example of if a game came out that was about the Crusades and you fight in real battles, but you could play as any kind of character from any number of cultures, religions, or even fling magic around, would that somehow be able to work? And it can work, but it's tricky to make it work in a way that feels authentic and not just, yeah, we just wanted to make a fantasy game and we decided to go ahead and set it in the real world just because. I think a prime example of both how this can work and how it doesn't work at the same time is the Assassin's Creed series. So, you take a look at the various Assassin's Creed games, and they play around a lot with historical characters, historical events, obviously historical settings, and trying to recreate the look and feel of those settings, and they do a very good job of that for the most part. But they're very fast and loose with the actual characters, the actual way the events play out, and in the more recent games with a lot of the supernatural elements that occur because of the whole sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic thing. And when they're doing things well, the events are occurring around you, but you're not necessarily directly involved in them. You're just doing your thing as Assassins versus Templars, and that of course includes the supernatural stuff, but it's not necessarily influencing the real world all that much. So the real-world setting and events are really more to flavor the experience rather than just the be-all, end-all of the experience. You can make it kind of work in a situation like that, but at the other end of the spectrum, they just dive off the deep end of complete nonsense when it comes to the supernatural stuff, particularly in Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Valhalla, and to a somewhat lesser extent Origins. And they have to be really careful about how they pull that off, otherwise it just comes across as utterly ridiculous. Like, it's fine for Bayek to fight the Serpent because he's having a vision at the time, and it makes it abundantly clear he's hallucinating the whole thing. It's all in his head, it's not anything that's actually happening. But then you get further on in the game, you get into the DLC, where you're going into the various tombs of the pharaohs and such, and you're dealing with blatantly supernatural things that aren't necessarily just in Bayek's head. So that's where they blur the line a lot, and they blur the line a lot with Assassin's Creed Odyssey as well, with a lot of just blatantly supernatural things happening pretty much all the time. And of course, Valhalla has an entire expansion pack called Dawn of Ragnarok, which is, of course, you playing as Odin going through Ragnarok. So they have to be careful with how they implement this kind of stuff. If they don't implement it correctly, then it just jumps the shark and becomes utterly ridiculous, and in turn just completely squanders the setting. But if they lean into the entire setting being supernatural right from the get-go, like say you're setting something in ancient Greece, but it's obviously mythological ancient Greece right from the get-go, you're always encountering fantastical things, then it makes sense, because it is effectively a fantasy setting, even though it is based on what we know about ancient Greece. And you have to remember that back in those days, people and mythology were much more closely entwined. They felt that the gods and various monsters and demons and such were very real things that actually acted on the world around them. So when you keep that kind of thing in mind, it makes it a lot easier to turn a historical setting, particularly in the ancient world, into a more fantastical one. But the more recent you get in history, the more difficult that becomes, because the mentality would shift more and more. So you always have to be very careful with how you implement these things. If you're going to use supernatural elements in something set in an actual historical setting, either keep it very localized to something that's only occurring within the context of your story, which is not necessarily having a major effect on the world around you, or completely embrace the fantastical elements. And the best way you can do that is to lean very heavily into local myths and legends. I mean, if you think about things like Arthurian legend or the Norse sagas, there are blatantly supernatural things that happen in those all the time, and those are ostensibly set in the real world. So you can make it work. You just have to be very careful about how you do it and make it an authentic kind of fantasy for its setting. So if it's set in, say, Scandinavia, then lean more into what the Norse sagas have. So you're going to be dealing a lot more with Norse mythology. If it's set in, say, England or Wales, then lean more into Arthurian legend. And if it's set in more of the Near East, then you can pull from stuff like the Epic of Gilgamesh or Arabian Nights or any number of things like that. So if it's a game that's set in a historical period and you want it to be grounded in reality, then by all means go for historical accuracy as much as you can. But if it's something that's inspired by a real history, and maybe plays around with historical events, but isn't really grounded in reality, so it's more of a fantasy type game, then lean more into that local mythology. That gives much more of a sense of authenticity when you do that, and that will actually work a hell of a lot better than if you were to just, say, toss some Tolkien-esque orcs into Sengoku period Japan. I'm not necessarily saying that it cannot be done. If the person who makes it is very careful about it, they can probably pull it off. But let's face it, the vast majority of game developers out there just aren't going to have the kind of care and attention to detail that would actually make that work. Anyway, moving on to a question from Endeavor. How do I see gaming in the next 5 years? Do I think the AAA industry will continue to thrive or continue its decline? I really wouldn't say it's thriving right now. They're already in decline, and given their incredibly short-sighted and stupid decision-making that they've been doing over the past couple of decades at this point, I don't really see them adjusting course and actually making things better anytime soon. So I imagine that, especially in the AAA space, we will continue to see games that have absurdly bloated budgets just utterly collapsing on themselves. We'll continue to see mass layoffs, and of course the major publishers in particular will continue to try to degrade the rights of consumers. As for the indie space, it's doing fine for the most part, and it'll probably continue to do fine. It might expand, it might not, we'll see. I'm hoping that the AA space can improve, because over the past decade or so, we have seen the AA section of the industry, the middle market titles basically, decline into the point where they're barely even a thing anymore, and it's all because the big publishers just will not fund those projects. They don't think it's worth investing the budget into. They want to have all the major hits, and they feel like the AAA stuff is the only way they can do that. And of course, indies usually don't have the resources to be able to do a AA game, so AA experiences barely even exist anymore. We have had a few successes here and there. As far as I understand, Expedition 33 has been very successful, and I would really consider that a AA game. So hopefully we can see the AA side of the industry expand a bit, and that'll make the entire industry healthier as a whole. This whole, it's either indie with small projects, or it's these massive over-bloated AAA games, is completely unsustainable, and it needs to change or it'll cause major collapse. But as for whether those trends will change within 5 years, I really don't know. I imagine the industry will continue its general decline from the AAA space, the indie space will continue to coast along just fine, and the AA's, honestly, even though I would like to see the AA space expand, will probably just continue to barely exist. And now we're going to round all of the questions out here with a question from Ocean Planet, which is, people have been predicting a new video game crash for at least a decade. Seeing the ridiculous state of AAA gaming, it seems logical. It never really happens though. People keep buying the FIFAs and the CODs, no matter how crappy these games are. My thoughts, do I think it's ever going to happen? Now, I highly doubt we will ever see another 1983-esque crash where it's just a massive section of the industry basically collapses overnight. I'm not really sure if the industry could ever actually decline to that point again. There are some incredibly boneheaded decisions coming in from the major game developers and publishers. Stuff like The Outer Worlds 2 being $80 US for the standard edition. That is just ridiculous. Game prices are already really straining a lot of people's wallets, and if they continue to increase like that, we will see some major changes in the AAA space in particular, because they're the ones who are going to be hit hardest by that. But as for whether there will be just vast swaths of the industry completely collapsing and we'll see major companies topple, I really don't see that happening. I mean, particularly with stuff like Microsoft, they would have to make a series of so mind-bogglingly stupid decisions that it would cause the entire company, not just the Xbox division, to collapse. And I really don't see that happening. And of course, with the likes of Sony, they've got their hands in all manner of things other than gaming as well, so it's not like they would go under if gaming collapsed on them. They would definitely have to take a massive hit, and it would gut large sections of the company, don't get me wrong, but we wouldn't see it completely collapse on itself. But the simple reality is that the current direction the industry is going in just isn't sustainable at all. Games are taking increasingly long to come out, they're releasing in incredibly broken, buggy, unfinished states, their budgets are just getting completely out of control. Major publishers in particular are way too focused on how much they can monetize the games, not whether they're actually worth playing in the first place, leading to those games just not selling well, and of course the project ultimately failing. It's all just a complete mess right now, and if these companies don't correct course in very quickly at that, then the situation's going to get a lot worse for them, and we will probably see a lot of layoffs. We'll probably see some of the smaller companies that are still in the AAA space closing down or getting folded into other studios and such. But I don't know if we're going to get a full-scale industry crash like we did back in '83. I don't think it'll ever get quite that bad again. It'll get bad, don't get me wrong, especially if they don't course correct, but it probably won't get 83 levels of bad. But as for when the industry is going to start collapsing on itself, it already kind of has, so we're not necessarily in the middle of a 1983-esque crash, but we're very much in a rapid and severe, I guess depression is probably the best way to describe it, at least in the AAA gaming space. The indie space is mostly fine right now, but AAAs are just really suffering right now, and it doesn't seem like they're making any attempt to improve their situation. So who knows? Maybe we will get another 83-esque crash, but I don't really see that happening. I see us having a major shift over the next several years where companies downsize considerably and tighten their budgets a lot more, and hopefully we'll get more of that and we'll get more games that are actually worth playing instead of just games that are meant to siphon as much money out of the player as possible. All that said, that was the Q&A for this year. Thanks for bearing with me on how long this video took to come out. I've been chipping away at it bit by bit for quite a while now, and I hope you all enjoyed it. So thank you all very much for watching. Thanks for bearing with me till the end here. And if you like the channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really helps out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. If you have a question for next year's Q&A, feel free to submit it in the comments below, and if there's a particular question that you asked for this year's Q&A but I didn't go over it, then feel free to remind me about it in the comments, and I'll take a look, and if it's something that I deliberately chose not to answer, I'll explain why I didn't answer it, and if it's something that I simply missed, then I'll go ahead and add it to next year's Q&A list. Of course, all the same rules will apply there. You'll have until the end of February of 2026 to submit your questions for the 2026 Q&A. So feel free to start asking, and I'll go ahead and start adding some questions to the list. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.